coming from a place like Baltimore where everybody has their hands in something, and I sometimes struggle and grasp at what it must be like to have been a Black person that was raised here, and I'm so grateful I was raised in Baltimore. Like it's got its stuff, but that's home. And it definitely even shaped my career. Like even my career being in health and wellness, it started in Baltimore. A lot of people don't realize that. Like the yoga part started in San Diego, but my personal yoga practice and my journey all began in Baltimore.
Awesome. And I think you kind of walked us right into the next question. So like, how did this journey begin in Baltimore?
So how much time we got? So my journey into wellness in Baltimore, when I was an undergrad, I was a peer health educator. So I knew about yoga. I knew about health and well-being. I was super invested. I knew I wanted to work in health and wellness. But I wouldn't say that movement and well-being practices that I know them, the way that I know them here in San Diego, were as prevalent. We have lots of sports. I grew up as an athlete, so I was very familiar with that. But as far as other movement practices, other mindfulness practices, I feel like we were just starting to scratch the surface of those when I was in college. And I had taken a couple of yoga classes. I had one in high school where I like locked my knees and almost passed out. So that kind of put a weird taste in my mouth. I learned from that experience. And then when I was a peer health educator, we did a health fair. We had a yoga teacher come, but we were all wearing like jeans and t-shirts. Like nobody could really get into the practice. So I was kind of indifferent about it. And then I went through some really tough stuff my junior year of college, and yoga came back around as something that might support me through that. And so, I'm like, okay, I'll give this thing a shot. At this point, people say it's good for stress relief. And I went to one yoga class and I didn't like it. I always try to stress people. The first class I went to as an adult, I did not like. And in hindsight, I know why I didn't like it. I went to a gym that was for women who were 35 and older, and I like walk in there at 20, and they're like, "What are you doing? Why are you here?" So the vibes were off because I was in their space, and I see that now, being not very aware. But the next class I went to, I didn't give up after that first one. The next class I went to was at a boxing gym randomly, but the teacher was a trauma-informed teacher, and so the way that she led the practice was, when I now know it to be, very embodied. I didn't have that language back then. I didn't know that word back then, but it was a very embodied practice of really returning your mind and your body back to each other. And she really held space for us to just feel instead of trying to do so much. And it cracked me right wide open. I sobbed, like ugly cried on the mat. But I also felt this just great wave of release and relief from the practice, and realized at that moment, okay, there's something to this that's bigger than stretching. It's bigger than being able to be flexible. There's some real stuff happening here, and it piqued my interest. And so, yeah, that started in a tiny little sweaty boxing gym in Baltimore.
Tiny, sweaty, boxy gym in Baltimore. What a beautiful place for it to start. You mentioned something that I really wanted to make sure we gave space for, and that's this misconception, for lack of a better word, of yoga being about stretching and flexibility. I think that, especially speaking from a cis male perspective, I think when we first grow up hearing about yoga, it's oh, well, that's a girly fitness thing. Oh, you're just trying to be more flexible, or you don't need to do yoga, go lift some weights. If I could just go back to younger Kyler and let him know that if he decides to try to master yoga poses versus trying to get that damn dumbbell up, or try to lift and do chest and whatnot, my back wouldn't be hurting as much when I stand up at work and whatnot. So I guess the question, or kind of leading you into your thoughts, is what do you have to say when people think that yoga is just about stretching or just about flexibility?
Oh gosh, I think it depends on their perspective, but the number one thing I tell folks is that yoga is physical asana. So what you see, the poses, is one of 8 limbs of yoga. When you get into yoga philosophy, movement is just 1/8 of the overarching philosophy around the practice. Yoga is so much deeper and richer than stretching, and stretching is great. But if you come to my class thinking you're gonna get a stretch, you might be a little surprised, because you will get a stretch, but it's not just holding static poses. And I just like, sidebar a little bit into yoga history. When the physical asana first became about thousands, hundreds of years ago, women were not allowed to practice. Cisgender women were not allowed to practice yoga. It was for men. It was training for warriors, because what we know now is that yoga helps with your pain tolerance. It helps with your mental agility. Now, they weren't necessarily doing it for that. It was more for the philosophical sense, but you can see why this is not something that was about stretching. It was about endurance. It was about connecting mind and body to self in this like sort of higher sense of being. It's very spiritual, not religious, but it's very spiritual. And so to me, if you want to have a yoga practice that is primarily based in stretching, then you might want to try a stretching class. A yoga class to me there's so much richness there if you're open to the possibility. And I also will say that one of my teachers is a man, a very strong, really incredibly brilliant man. And he often says, even to this day, after 20 something years of teaching yoga, how many guys are still surprised when they see him as a teacher. But he works with athletes, because that in the off season, helping them stay conditioned, helping them stay mobile. The number one thing I guess I could say when people say like, it's just stretching, why should I try this, is, to your point, it's preparing your body, it's helping your pain tolerance, it's helping you actually move better for longer. And why not give yourself something that's going to make you feel better in all of the senses if you can?